Hello, I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, and welcome to the latest KRAD COVID reading, in which I entertain you during our worldwide coronavirus nightmare. This time around, I'm going to be reading a short story that was a big thrill for me to do back in 2015. In 2015 and 2016, IDW Publishing and Jonathan Maberry secured the rights to do an X-Files anthology. IDW was already doing X-Files comics, and Jonathan also wanted to put together a 3 volumes of short stories that were involved in the X-Files. At the time they got the license, part of why they agreed to it, why Fox agreed to it and why Chris Carter agreed to it, was that it's like, well, nobody cares about the X-Files anymore anyway. It was a 90s thing. It's all gone. And then not long after Jonathan started putting this together, the Fox network decided to air the revival of the X-Files that we got in 2016. Anyway, I was a huge fan of the X-Files back when it was on the air. In fact, my one and only experience with convention running, I've been to many conventions as a guest, or as an attendee, or as press, or once as security, long story. The only time I've ever actually been involved in the running of a convention was for a very small X-Files focused convention that I helped Laura Ann Gilman do. It was Laura Ann's thing, mainly, and I was her Lord High everything else, as it were. And it was called File Cabin. Very small convention, a couple hundred people in New Jersey in the mid-90s. So that's how much of an X-Files fan I was. So when these anthologies came up, I jumped at the chance to do a short story. So this is my story, which was actually nominated for a Scribe Award for Best Short Story. It did not win. It appeared in the first of the 3 anthologies, which was called Trust No One. The others were called The Truth Is Out There and Secret Agendas. And they're all available from IDW. You should check them out. And meanwhile, here is my story, which is called Back in El Paso, My Life Would Be Worthless. The story takes place between the second season X-Files episodes Our Town and Anasazi, so toward the end of the second season. The J. Edgar Hoover Building, Washington, D.C., April 3rd, 1995. Special Agent Jack Colt arrived at the assistant director's office, feeling very much like a school kid who was sent to the principal's office. Usually, the assistant special agent in charge doled out his assignments, but it was the ASAC who told him to report to A.D. Skinner. The A.D.'s assistant smiled at him. "One moment, please." She pushed a button on her phone and said, "Agent Colt is here." Skinner's tinny voice sounded over her phone's speaker. "Send him in." Cole nodded to the assistant and opened the wooden door to Skinner's expansive office. The AD was standing at his desk, back to the window, while a familiar man, in a plaid shirt, jeans, and cowboy boots, sat in one of the guest chairs. The latter rose to his feet, running one hand over his bald head. "Thanks for coming, Agent Colt," Skinner said. He always sounded like he was speaking through a clenched jaw. "I believe you know Detective Johnson." "Of course." He reached out to shake the man's hand, and Martin Johnson, of the El Paso Police Department, returned it firmly. "What brings you up from El Paso, Martin?" His face fell. "Oh, Christ, don't tell me Nobilis is putting together another appeal." Johnson sat back down. "No, but I reckon he'll be putting one together soon. I'm afraid we found 2 more bodies. Brunette women, both strangled, sliced across the stomach. So it's copycat. And with the skin cream on the women's nether regions." Colt winced. "Somebody must have let that out to the public." "No, sir, they did not," Johnson said tightly. "As God is my witness, the only folks who know that particular detail in El Paso are Doc Gardner, me, and Detective Martinez. That's why I flew up here instead of calling. Loose lips sinking ships and all that." Colt shook his head. "And Nobilis is still in prison." "Hell, he's in solitary. He ain't had no visitors. He ain't sent no mail out, and we ain't letting him see any of the mail he does get." "Who's he get mail from?" Johnson shrugged. The usual. Groupies, lawyers, fetishists. You don't see none of it, so it ain't that. I'm thinking we got the wrong guy. Again." "That's not possible," Colt snapped. Skinner snapped right back. "That's enough, Agent Colt. Obviously, this new set of murders needs to be investigated." "Look," Johnson said, "most of the murders we got to deal with back home are morons killing other morons. Kids fighting over sneakers. Drug dealers fighting over street corners. Men fighting over women. This freako stuff is at our league, which is why we called y'all in the first place 2 years ago. Colt noticed the file on Skinner's desk. May I? Skinner nodded. Picking it up, Colt said, "You called us in, Martin, because more murders kept happening after you put people in jail. You arrested Arlo Montrose, and then 2 more murders. You arrested Buck Halverson, then 4 more murders. You arrested Jebediah Zipkiss, and then 5 more murders, and I'm on a plane to El Paso. You arrested Frank Nobilis, and now we got 2 more. I arrested Nobilis because he's who the evidence pointed to. Evidence doesn't lie." Skinner's phone buzzed, followed by his assistant's voice over the speaker. "Agents Scully and Mulder are here." Colt's head snapped up toward the AD. Skinner pushed a button on his phone. "Send them in." The door opened to a tall, skinny, dark-haired man in a gray suit very much like the one Colt was wearing, and a petite redhead in a green pantsuit. Pointing at the 2 new arrivals, Colt asked, "What are the 2 nutjobs doing here?" Smirking, Fox Mulder said, "Actually, we prefer the term sanity challenged. And technically, I'm the nutjob. Scully here's the skeptic." Agents Scully and Mulder have a lot of experience with cases that are out of the ordinary, Skinner said. Rolling his eyes, Colt said, "Oh, please. This isn't one of Mulder's wackadoodle alien things. It's a serial killer. And yes," he said quickly, as Mulder was opening his mouth, "I know you worked in behavioral sciences and violent crimes." "Actually," Mulder said, "I was just going to ask if we could sit down." Johnson had risen to his feet, prompting Skinner to say, "Detective Johnson, this is Special Agent Fox Mulder and his partner, Special Agent Dana Scully. They'll be assisting Special Agent Colt." Mulder shook the man's hand, as did Scully. "Pleasure to be meeting you both," Johnson said. "I gotta hit the road. I'm flying back tonight. I'll pick you all up at the airport tomorrow." "Thank you, Detective," Scully said with a small smile. Colt turned his gaze upon Skinner. "I work alone, sir." "No, Agent Colt, you work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Whether or not you are permitted to flout FBI procedure regarding partnership is entirely up to the people who supervise you. While your ASAC is willing to indulge you on the majority of your cases, I am not willing to do so on this case. All 3 of you are on a plane to El Paso tomorrow morning to investigate these latest murders. See if they match the ones that Frank Nobilis is in prison for. My assistant will send you your tickets through inner office." Colt blew out a long breath. "Happy, happy, joy, joy. Fine, we'll fly to El Paso." Vista Atlantic Flight 1013, in transit between Washington, D.C. and Dallas, Texas. April 4th, 1995. "You know, I get why you 2 were assigned to me now." Colt was staring at Mulder and Scully, sitting across the aisle from him. The Bureau had sprung for first-class seats, which Colt had made a mental note to thank Skinner for, and Colt had been fortunate enough not to have a seatmate. The X-Files goons were in the 2 seats across from him. Mulder had a Walkman in his lap, headphones in his ears, eyes closed. He was in the window seat, leaving Scully to read over files in the aisle seat. Scully removed her reading glasses, set the file down on the tray table, and stared at him, green eyes flashing. "And why is that, Agent Colt?" "Same reason why the Bureau keeps your little goon squad running. Keeps the clearance rate up." "Excuse me?" Scully asked with a frown. "Come on! For what other reason would you guys be allowed to continue? You get all the crazy cases that can't actually be closed, but since you're a special unit, you don't get counted with the regular stats. So the public thinks that we have a better clearance rate than we actually have, and they feel safer." "You really believe that?" "You don't? Come on, Agent Scully. I spent last night looking over your recent case history." Colt started enumerating on his fingers the files he'd read last night while staying late at the office. If he was going to be stuck with these garbanzos, he wanted an idea of their casework. "In the last few months alone, we've got Mount Avalon, 4 deaths, 2 people missing and presumed dead, no arrest. Worcester, Massachusetts, a woman raped and assaulted, 2 orderlies murdered, Agent Mulder assaulted, no arrests. Milford Haven, Massachusetts, 6 people killed, a woman missing and presumed dead, no arrests. The USS Ardent, almost the entire crew missing and presumed dead, no arrests. Gibsonton, Florida, 3 people murdered, suspects still missing, no arrests. Murray, Virginia, 3 members of a family, including a 3-year-old, murdered, and, you guessed it, no arrests. We've also closed a few cases. The chicken plant in Dudley, Arkansas, the murders in Fairfield, Idaho, and the INS station in North Carolina, the death fetishist in Minneapolis. Colt held out the hand. Yeah, sure, you've run into a couple, and I gotta give you credit for that loony in Minneapolis. That was a good bust. But let's face it, the only reason the Bureau puts up with your crap clearance rate is that it makes the rest of us look good. Scully shook her head. That's one theory. Look, whatever. But I prefer to work alone, all right? You two can come along and cover the Bureau's ass in case it winds up going into the toilet, but stay out of my way when we get down there. I've had enough of partners. Then he recalled something else he'd read the previous night. And I think you're in a good position to understand why. How's that? The last regular partner I had got shot in the head. And he was already pretty crazy before that, and the bullet rattling around in his cranium just made him worse. Name of Dwayne Barry. Scully went rigid. Most people wouldn't notice any difference, but he could see her entire body freeze up, even though there was almost no discernible change to her facial expression. He was always wound too tight even before he caught a bullet. Always talking about himself in the third person was like being partnered with Bob Dole. He gave her an apologetic look. I'm sorry you had to go through that with him. I'm fine. Scully said those 2 words with the same lack of conviction that relatives of murder victims did when people idiotically asked them how they were doing. Either way, after 2 years of being partnered with that jackass, you can see why I'm not exactly eager to embrace the notion of teamwork. Scully had been staring at an indeterminate point on the plane's floor, but now she looked up and stared intently right at Colt once again. Despite everything, Colt actually flinched, and then decided that Agent Scully must have been damn good at interrogations. She said, "You mentioned our clearance rate. Maybe it's not what it could be. But at the very least, we've been able to put a stop to more than one tragedy before it could happen, or, failing that, before it could get worse. And the successes we have had are due to Agent Mulder and I working together." Colt shrugged. "If you say so. But I got a lot more closed cases under my name than you do, or that I did when I was partnered with your erstwhile kidnapper." El Paso County Medical Examiner's Office, El Paso, Texas, April 4th, 1995. Damn. Colt regarded the 2 bodies on slabs with a depressing sense of deja vu. "Something wrong, Agent Colt?" Mulder asked. Colt looked up, having momentarily forgotten that he had 2 tag-alongs. The 3 of them had been led by an assistant to this exam room, containing the 2 latest victims of what the local news had been calling the El Paso Ripper for the last several years. No, just up until now I was kind of half entertaining the notion that EPPD screwed up. This was just an unrelated double murder, but looking at these 2 now. A voice came from the doorway. "Nice to see you're still a judgmental bastard, Jack." Looking over, Colt smiled at the entrance of the stooped-over form of Louise Gardner, the chief medical examiner for El Paso County. "Always, Louise, you know that." "You brought company this time." Indicating the other agents with his left hand, Colt said, "Dr. Louise Gardner, these are Agents Dana Scully and Fox Mulder. They'll be helping me out." "Seriously? Your parents named you Fox? You got brothers named ABC, NBC, and CBS, too?" Without missing a beat, Mulder said, "My oldest brother is named DuPont, but he's kind of the black sheep of the family." Scully interjected before the banter could continue. "I'm also a medical doctor. I'd like to assist on the autopsy." Gardner grinned, showing off her dentures. "Agent Scully, you just made my assistant's day. He's been dreading this, and he'll be more than happy to defer to you." Colt nodded. "I need to re-interview the witnesses." "I'll come with you," Mulder said. With a wince, Colt started. "Look, Agent Mulder, why don't you do what Skinner asked and back you up?" "Sure." Mulder shot a sardonic grin at Colt. "Fine." Colt let out a very long, very annoyed sigh. "I'm going to get started on Mrs. Underwood here," Gardner said, pointing at the body of Eleanor Underwood, the first victim. "Agent Scully, why don't you scrub in and tackle Mrs. Alvarez?" Scully nodded and went over to the closet to get a set of scrubs. Colt sighed, grateful that he'd managed to ditch one of them at least. With luck, he'd be able to dump Mulder, too. The first person Colt and Mulder talked to was the husband of the first victim, Todd Underwood. Can you tell us where you were the night of the second, Mr. Underwood? I told the cops this already. Why are you asking me this stuff? We're not the cops, Mr. Underwood, Colt said patiently. We're the FBI. And we believe there may be a connection between Eleanor's death and other deaths in the city over the past few years. Underwood blinked. Say what? You talking about the El Paso Ripper? Man, they got that son of a bitch in jail. Anyhow, how was it work? Mulder then asked, did Eleanor meet anyone new recently? Or did someone come back into her life that she hadn't seen in a while? Nah, I mean, she worked at one of them call centers, and they got people coming and going all the time, so there's always new people there, but that's it. Frowning, Mulder checked the file. This says she's unemployed. Yeah, she got fired last week. Colt sighed. That wasn't in the file, and he made a mental note to yell at Martin Johnson later. Their next stop was Donna Alvarez's roommate, Katerina Rossoff. They both worked as nurses at the Bliss Private Hospital just outside of town. I'm glad you're here, actually, Rossoff said with a slight Russian accent. That detective asked me to telephone him if I recalled something, but I'm afraid I misplaced the business card he handed me. There was a man at the hospital who was very rude to Donna. He was visiting another client. This was about a week before she was attacked. It was either the 30th or the 31st. I know it was before the 1st because it was before the doctors decided to play April Fool's joke on nurses. Rossoff's tone indicated how little she thought of that particular tradition. Why didn't you mention this to the police? Colt asked. Rossoff looked sheepish. I had forgot about it as soon as it happened, honestly. We get rude people in the hospital all the time. But I remembered this man after thinking because he was so rude. Can you provide a description of him? I'm afraid not, but our hospital uses videotape surveillance. They keep all the tapes once they have been fully recorded on for security purposes. Colt asked a few more questions, confirming, as it said in the report, that Alvarez didn't have a boyfriend. Then he and Mulder took their leave. Well, Colt said, I don't want to get too optimistic. We're already in better shape than when we started, between this cranky hospital visitor and the job that Underwood got fired from. I don't want to count out the husband. It's too bad that Alvarez wasn't seeing anyone. Mulder frowned. What difference does that make? Serial killers like the El Paso Ripper almost never know their victims intimately. Sometimes they suffer delusions that they do, but they're most often strangers. For that matter, all the people that the EPPD and you imprisoned have been strangers to the victims. Yeah, and they've all been the wrong guy. Maybe it's time to take a different approach. Intimate contact doesn't make sense, Mulder said. Unless you think there's a huge field of commonality between an unemployed telemarketer and a nurse at a private hospital. He smiled. Besides, people don't usually need a reason to want to kill a telemarketer. And anyhow, your theory still holds. We already talked to Alvarez's significant other. Colt frowned. What? Indicating the small house with a shake of his head. Mulder said, Didn't you take a good look at the place? Only one bedroom, and the living room sofa doesn't fold out. They slept in the same room, likely in the same bed. They probably kept it quiet since they worked together, and private hospitals in Texas tend to be funded by old money Southern types who wouldn't look kindly on a homosexual relationship. For several seconds, Colt just looked at Mulder. He wanted to argue the point, but looking back over his memory of the house, all the clues were there. Not to mention how grief-stricken Johnson said that Alvarez was over her roommate dying. Or Rossoff was, over her roommate dying. Son of a bitch. Mulder smirked. Not bad for a sanity-challenged special agent. Colt sighed. He hoped that Mulder wasn't going to be this self-righteous for the entire case. Fine, I think at this point we need to split up. I'll go check the place where Underwood worked. You go to Bliss Hospital and go through the tapes. If he was going to be saddled with partners, he was damn well going to let one of them do the drudge work. The Dewdrop Inn, room 120, El Paso, Texas, April 4th, 1995. Very reluctantly, Colt had to admit that having two other pairs of feet to do legwork had its uses. He sat in his hotel room's comfy chair while the ex-goons sat in the two chairs by the table near the window. Scully was filling them in on the autopsies of the two latest victims first. There were no real surprises in either case, which is unfortunate since something new might provide us with a lead. However, both Eleanor Underwood and Donna Alvarez were killed by a serrated blade cutting open their carotid artery. Both stomachs were slashed post-mortem, and both women had a skin cream applied to their vaginas. The cream is still out for testing, but both Dr. Gardner and I are fairly certain it's the same cream that was used in the other El Paso Ripper killings. Colt snarled. Couldn't we please not call them that? Giving a small smile, Scully said, Sorry, that's the phrase Dr. Gardner used. She's an excellent pathologist. In any event, just as with the others, there's no useful trace evidence. However, two things did give me pause. That got Colt's attention. As Scully had indicated, something discrepant from the previous murders would have been useful. But hearing that it was the same thing again just made him want to bang his head against the wall. Scully continued, We did find some trace evidence, but it tested as inert matter. So? I checked the files. That same inert matter was found on several other victims. I had Dr. Gardner pull the particles from the other cases so the lab can run more tests. She sighed. I may need to ship them to Quantico, though. The lab here is not exactly up to standards. Yeah, welcome to West Texas, Colt muttered. After the last time I was here, the mayor, the governor, and I had a long talk about the inadequacy of the labs here. Nice to see they listened. Mulder shook his head. I'm shocked to learn that politicians misled you. Colt shot Mulder a look. Casablanca? Didn't think that was your kind of film. Colt had no idea if the rumors about Mulder's tape collection were true, although Agent Delvecchio had insisted those tapes were his if something ever happened to Mulder. Since Mulder didn't rise to the bait, Colt turned his attention back to Scully. You said there were two things. Nodding, Scully said, There was dust in the mouth. Lab said it was disintegrated bone fragments. Colt leaned back, disappointed. Yeah, that was in all the bodies. Figured it was part of the fetish thing. Mulder, though, after sitting slumped in his chair, sat ramrod straight all of a sudden. Bone fragments. You're sure? The lab's not so bad that it can't identify bone, Scully said with another of her small smiles. Yes, I'm sure. It could be corpse dust. What kind of dust? Colt did not like where this was going. Several Native American tribes have legends of skinwalkers, shape-changers who can take on the forms of different animals. Agent Scully and I encountered one last year in Browning, Montana. Colt shot Scully a look, but she had her poker face on. Of course, she wasn't denying it. Then he recalled one of the files on a case they had in Browning, where a local Native American was killed by a ranch owner, who was then killed probably by the first victim's son, who was shot by Scully in self-defense. Mulder's report had mentioned skinwalkers and werewolves, while Scully's only made a passing mention of clinical lycanthropy. Mulder was still babbling. In Navajo folklore, the Yi-Nadlushti blows corpse dust into a victim's face. It's made from ground-up bones, ideally the bones of a small child. Speaking in what Colt instantly identified as a long-suffering tone, Scully said, Mulder, even if this is like what we saw in Browning, in every legend, skinwalkers take on the form of animals. True, but it's not much of a leap to go from changing into an animal to changing into a person. Scientifically speaking, it's probably easier because there's less shifting of mass. A bitter laugh burst from Colt's mouth. I can't believe you used the phrase scientifically speaking in that sentence. But it does fit the evidence, Mulder said insistently. A killer who can change shape would explain why we have the same murders committed with the same methods, including the portions not revealed to the public, while having 4 wildly different suspects. It also might explain the inert matter. It could be the altered skin cells that the skinwalker uses. Tightly, Agent Colt said, Agent Mulder, I know for a fact that you graduated at the top of your class at Quantico, which leads me to think it was a particularly dumb class that year. So I know that you simply had to be there for the part where they told you that an investigator doesn't come up with a theory and find evidence to fit it. We find evidence and then concoct a theory. Mulder started to talk again, but Colt cut him off. I don't want to hear it. What did you find out at the hospital? For a few seconds, Mulder just looked at Colt with that vacant stare of his. Then he grabbed a folder filled with several 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. Private hospitals get all the best toys. Their security videos record onto Super 8 tapes, and they have a 4-color printer. This is the guy Nurse Rossov was talking about. He started yelling at Nurse Alvarez at a little after 3 p.m. on the 31st. He handed Colt the folder. Opening it, he saw several lightly curled pieces of paper that felt cool to the touch. Each sheet had screen captures from the surveillance tape of a tall man with short, dark hair and thick, plastic-framed glasses arguing with Rossov. Each printout had a date and timestamp on the lower left-hand corner. 3/31/95, 1507, and so on. Colt let out a huge grin. We got him. He grabbed a file folder of his own. Underwood was fired after she got into a fight with another telemarketer, a guy named Orville Hoblock. And when I say fight, I mean physical altercation. I got the photocopy of Hoblock's driver's license. The staff kept them on file. He pulled out the photocopy in question and handed it to Scully. The picture on the Texas State driver's license belonging to one Orville Hoblock was an almost perfect match for the picture of the person on Mulder's fancy colored printout. El Paso Police Department Headquarters, City Hall, El Paso, Texas, April 5th, 1995. Look, I'm telling you, I didn't kill those women. I wasn't even in El Paso. Colt shook his head. They always pulled this. EPPD had brought Orville Hoblock in without a fuss, as he was still unemployed and was still at home and was sitting at home watching television, according to Detective Johnson. Now he was sitting in one of the small interrogation rooms in the portion of City Hall that was used by the local cops. Mr. Hoblock, we have video surveillance of you getting into a verbal altercation with one of the victims and eyewitness accounts of you getting into a physical altercation with another. He shook his head. I knew it. I knew you bastards would try to tie Ellie's death to me. Look, yeah, we got into a fight. She was an uptight bitch and she got in my face, but I didn't kill her. I didn't even know who the other one was. Nurse Donna Alvarez. Colt placed the color printouts Mulder had gotten in front of him on the metal table. This is you yelling at her on the 31st. She was dead 2 days later. Look, I didn't... Hoblock looked at the printouts, and his eyes went wide under his plastic-framed glasses. Holy crapola, that guy looks just like me. It is you. No, it isn't. Hoblock started fidgeting in the chair. You said that was the 31st? I wasn't even in El Paso. I was in Corpus Christi. I got fired. I went to visit my dad out there. He doesn't have a guest room, and I can't sleep on the couch without it chewing up my back, so I stayed in a Days Inn. I was there from the 30th to the 3rd, including when that pop singer got shot. What? Colt knew that a Latina singer named Selena had been shot by the president of her own fan club in Corpus Christi on the 31st. He'd only paid mild attention to it because Del Vecchio's daughter was heartbroken and he couldn't shut up about how little Maya was pounding her chest over it. For the next 2 hours, Colt continued his interrogation of Hoblock. The man was temperamental, and he lost it and yelled more than once. It wasn't hard to see how he got into an altercation with Underwood, but it was getting hard to see how such a hothead could be the meticulous serial killer he'd been chasing. At one point, a knock came at the door, and Scully stuck her head in. Excuse me, Agent Colt? Your wife's on the phone. She says it's urgent. Since Scully knew damn well that Colt wasn't married, she was letting him know that she needed to see him outside without Hoblock knowing anything was amiss. Excuse me, he said, following Scully out the door. As soon as she shut the door behind him, Scully said, It's not him. He didn't kill Alvarez, and I don't know who Agent Mulder saw on the tape, but that wasn't him either. She led him down the hall to a room with a VCR and a television. Mulder and Johnson were already there. Detective Johnson, Agent Scully and I have been busy while you've been distracting Hoblock. Take a look at this, Mulder said as he pushed play on the VCR's remote. I got this from my granddaughter, Johnson said. She's a huge Selena fan, got a shrine in her bedroom even. The tape started showing a local news story from Corpus Christi about Selena's murder. They were interviewing people who were staying in the same hotel where Selena was shot. The first was a hysterical woman. The second, a black man who was pissed at all the people in the way of his hotel experience. And then a very familiar man with plastic-framed glasses. Look, I think it's a tragedy, but more because she was such a young woman. I mean, I don't listen to the music myself. I think it's garbage what kids listen to these days. But she wasn't even 25 years old yet. That's just really horrible. As he spoke, the caption at the bottom of the screen read, Orville Hoblock. Colt shook his head. That isn't possible. Johnson said, I talked to the hotel. They kept real close track of who was staying and for how long on account of what happened. Hoblock was there the dates he said he was, which means there ain't no way he killed either Alvarez or Underwood. All right, fine, he's out as a suspect, Colt said. Go ahead and kick him. We still have a suspect, Mulder said. Somebody who looks a lot like Hoblock was at that hospital yelling at Alvarez. Pointing a finger at Mulder, Colt said, Don't give me that shapeshifter crap, Mulder. We'll check the evidence again, interview more witnesses, and find out who did this and how they found out about the skin cream. Rising to his feet, Johnson said, Excuse me? Scully cut off Johnson before he could continue in that hostile tone. Agent Colt, the press coverage of these latest 2 murders has had no mention of the skin cream. It's probably still a secret. Well, obviously, Frank Nobilis didn't commit these 2 murders, Colt said, but the evidence that he killed the others is pretty compelling. Certainly the jury thought so. Actually, Mulder said, I've been looking over the folders on Nobilis, and there are a lot of holes in the case. There's no physical evidence tying Nobilis to the scenes. The eyewitness accounts, Colt nearly exploded, and actually felt an urge to hit Mulder. Where the hell do you get off? You're here to assist me on this case, Mulder. You got no business going back over old files. To Colt's annoyance, it was again Scully who spoke. They might be the same case. The whole reason you came down here is because it looked like it might be the same killer. We have to look at the case against Nobilis for the same reason why you looked at the cases against Montrose, Halverson, and Zipkiss before going after Nobilis 2 years ago. Colt glowered at Scully. He couldn't come up with a good response to that, so he stormed out of the video room rather than try to utter a bad one. The Dew Drop Inn, room 120, El Paso, Texas, April 7th, 1995. For the next 2 days, Colt decided to hammer on Hoblock. He was on the videotape. He was the only thing Alvarez and Underwood had in common. He had to be the one. Unfortunately, he had an airtight alibi, especially since the footage of his being interviewed in the wake of Selena being shot was picked up by several stations. To add insult to injury, he rented a car to make the 9-hour drive to Corpus Christi and back, and his credit card was used at several gas stations and service stops along I-10 and I-35. The mileage on the rental car when he returned it matched the 1,500 miles it would have taken to drive there and back, plus a little extra. Mulder and Scully weren't doing much better. Reluctantly, Colt met with them in his hotel room, again at 7 p.m. The nutjobs were kind enough to bring some takeout from a local Tex-Mex place. After swallowing a little bite of enchilada, Scully said, "We re-interviewed the witnesses you talked to about Nobilis. Sue Dietrich said she wasn't sure it was him anymore. Don Egan said you quoted him out of context." Colt rolled his eyes as he picked up his chicken taco. "Yeah, there was a reason why we didn't put him on the stand. What about that old guy, Jim Tolley?" "He refused to speak to us, saying you coerced him into testifying." "What? I did no such thing." "Damn it. 2 more murders and now everyone's backing off." Colt slammed a fist on the desk. After sipping his soda, Mulder said, "It wouldn't be the first time that people rush to make an eyewitness account in the heat of the moment, especially regarding a serial killer that has been around as long as the El Paso Ripper has. So we've got nothing." With a tilt of his head, Mulder replied, "Well, we've got a good case for Nobilis's appeal." "That isn't even a little funny, Mulder. Wasn't meant to be." Colt smirked. "Yeah, well, it's hard to tell with that deadpan of yours." The smirk fell, and he thought for a moment while gnawing on his taco. Much as he hated to admit it, the nutjobs are on the right track. "All right, let's take what you're doing one step further. I want to go back over everything, all the way back to the first murder, back in '88. The phone rang. Colt climbed out of his chair and went over to the table between the 2 double beds and picked up the receiver. "Colt, this is Detective Johnson. You need to get down to Concordia Cemetery right away, Agent Colt. We got us another body." Concordia Cemetery, El Paso, Texas, April 7th, 1995. "Keep the damn press out of here, will you please?" An EPPD uniform grabbed the photographer, who had apparently climbed the metal fence on Yondell Drive to get into the cemetery to see the latest victim of the El Paso Ripper. The paparazzo was tossed out the cemetery gate, where plenty of other members of the Fourth Estate were congregated about. The latest victim was named Julianne Kugler. Just like the others, who was a brunette woman with a slash across her belly, strangulation marks on her neck, but no evidence of a weapon that was used, just the ligature marks, skin cream applied to her genitalia, and dust in her mouth. Plus, there was that inert material near the wounds. Kugler had been placed on the ground of the cemetery, which was, unusually, more dirt than grass. It was the first cemetery Colt had visited that looked more like a ranch than a park. Scully was off on the side, talking on her cellular, while Mulder examined the body alongside Colt. Pointing at the mouth, Mulder said, "More corpse dust." "Enough with that, please," Colt said angrily. Scully ended her call, lowering the small plastic antenna on her phone before pocketing it. "That was Quantico. They examined the inert material that was on all the crime scenes, and they don't have any answers. They did detect some DNA markers, but nothing they could identify." So it's from something alive, Mulder said. Maybe, but they can't figure out what it is. There's not enough there. Colt frowned. That doesn't make any sense. If anything about this case made sense, Scully said, Miss Kugler would probably still be alive. Yeah, Colt sighed. All right, let's bag her up and get her away from the vipers. There's no blood here, so she was probably dumped. Johnson had been chatting with uniforms and other detectives and came over to where the 3 federal agents were standing. We got us some good news there. Our bad guy made his first mistake. Whole mess of people saw him dump the body. When? Mulder asked. Around 6:30 or so. Uniforms are taking statements now. Colt nodded. Okay, get the body to Gardner. Agent Scully, if you'd be so kind as to assist her. Scully said, of course. Colt noticed Mulder gazing out at the crowd of press and civilians all gathered at the entrance, held from squeezing through by a phalanx of cops. On the sidewalk by the metal fence on Stevens Street, several plainclothes and uniformed officers were talking to civilians and taking notes. Maybe we'll get lucky, Mulder said. The witnesses to previous victims caught glances and quick looks from far away. This is the first time we've got really solid eyewitness accounts. If he screwed that up, maybe he screwed up something else. Let's hope, Colt said. As the 3 FBI agents walked past that part of the fence, one of the witnesses, a taller, older man wearing a cowboy hat, caught sight of them. That's him! He cried out while pointing a finger right at Colt. A short, teenage Latina woman suddenly let loose with a barrage of Spanish. Colt was rusty, but he recalled enough of the language to know that she was doing the same thing as the man in the cowboy hat, pointing at Colt and saying that he did it. The hell? All the witnesses were now screaming and crying and pointing fingers right at Colt. That's him! He's the killer. Arrest that bastard now! Ay Dios, el asesino! Johnson stared at the trio, then said to Mulder, get him the hell out of here. Colt was just staring at the people, who all looked at him with fear and loathing. I don't... He felt Mulder's surprisingly strong grip on his arm. Let's go. But Colt just stood there, staring incomprehensibly. How can they think that I... Jack! Mulder said forcefully, and the nutjob's use of his first name finally snapped him out of it. We have to go. Yeah, of course. He let Mulder lead him through the crowd, which was quickly turning into an angry mob calling for the head of Jack Colt. El Paso Police Department Headquarters, City Hall, El Paso, Texas, April 8th, 1995. Quite a view. Colt turned away from the magnificent sight of the sun rising over the Franklin Mountains to see Scully standing behind him at the east-facing window of the police HQ section of El Paso City Hall. She was still wearing blue scrubs from her all-night autopsy of Kugler, though she wasn't wearing the cap, gloves, or goggles. While Colt shared Scully's understated appreciation of the view, he had bigger fish to fry. What the hell's going on, Agent Scully? I'm afraid there isn't a lot of good news, she said slowly. The trace evidence is exactly the same as the other victims, but we're no closer to knowing what the inert material is or where they're getting ground up bones from to put in the mouth. The only other biological trace we found belongs to the victim. She had been staring off to the side for a bit, but now she looked up to face Colt directly. In addition, 8 eyewitnesses described the person who dumped the body in the cemetery as you. With 2 exceptions, that being a pair of sisters, none of the 8 knew each other. None of them and didn't meet until they were brought here last night. They're crazy. Colt took a deep breath to keep himself from getting hysterical. He'd been up all night. Look, Dana, I didn't do this. I know you didn't. But these witnesses are sure that the perpetrator at least looked a lot like you. Scully blew out a breath. I need you to account for your whereabouts yesterday. Colt rolled his eyes. You know my whereabouts. No, Jack, Scully said intently. I don't. You spent the last several days avoiding Mulder and me, keeping us away from you. Yesterday we didn't see you at all until 7 o'clock last night in the hotel, and only heard from you when I called you to check first thing in the morning. That's an entire day during which a murder happened and you were sighted dumping the body where Agent Mulder and I can't back you up. And to make matters worse, you're familiar with the MO of the murders and you're a trained federal agent, so you have the means. All right. He thought back over the day. I was making phone calls from the hotel room, trying to find a hole in Hoblock's alibi. From the hotel phone? Scully asked, hopefully. Colt shook his head. No, I use my cellular. It's easier to keep all the calls there. It's easier on the expense reporting. He sighed. And the reception was sort of crap, so I walked around outside until I could find 3 bars. I honestly have no idea where I went. I don't really know my way around this town. This isn't good, Jack. Yeah. He sighed. I need a Coke. He wandered back down the hallway toward a vending machine. Reaching into his pants pocket, he was shocked to find nothing in his back left pocket. Oh, for God's sake, I don't have my wallet. What happened to it? Colt thought back over the previous night. I took it out to pay you guys for the Mexican food, and I must have left it on the desk when you got called to the cemetery. Relieved for so quotidian an explanation, he then turned to Scully. Suppose I can borrow 50 cents for a Coke. Unfortunately, scrubs don't have pockets. Scully actually smiled a little. The whole situation was absurd, and he was very grateful that she was the one talking to him. If it was Mulder, he'd be hip-deep in nonsense about shapeshifters. Speaking of whom, Mulder turned the corner and said, Scully, Colt, there you are. EPPD just got an anonymous tip that the killer is in a house on La Luz Avenue. Let's go, Colt said, eager to find something that would give them a proper break in this case, and one that didn't put his head on the chopping block. I'll meet you there, Scully said, heading to the women's room, no doubt to change out of her scrubs. Colt and Mulder went downstairs to the motor pool to find Johnson and his partner, Detective Martinez, putting on Kevlar vests. Martinez silently handed one to Mulder, but Johnson was staring at Colt. You ain't going, Jack. Oh, come off it, Martin. I'm the lead investigator. You're a suspect, Jack. I can't... Holding up a hand, Colt said, Stop it right there, detective. Until I'm given instructions by someone a hell of a lot higher up the food chain than you, this is still my case. So either arrest me on the flimsy-ass evidence you have, or give me a damn Kevlar. There was a brief, ugly pause, and then Johnson nodded at Martinez, who slowly reached into the trunk of the car and pulled out another vest. By the time Colt had velcroed himself into his, Scully had arrived and got a vest of her own. As they sat in the back of the EPPD Chevy Cavalier, Mulder whispered to Colt, You realize that a shapeshifter would explain both how Hoblock could be in two places at once and how someone who looks just like you could kill Kugler, right? Shut up, Mulder, Colt muttered. They arrived at a one-story house on La Luz, the only one on the block that had the driveway gate shut and padlocked. The padlock had plenty of rust, too. An EPPD SWAT team went in first, clearing the house, which didn't take too long as the house looked abandoned. Colt, Mulder, and Scully went in once the SWAT leader gave the all-clear. The place was all hardwood floors with laminate that was starting to wear off, and the floor was covered in blood spatter at varying levels of dryness. No furniture at all, not even internal doors on any of the hinges. But lots and lots of bloodstains. Ladies and gentlemen, Colt said with a smile, I think we may have us a crime scene. We've got more than that, Mulder said. Turning, Colt saw the agent was going for a wallet that was sitting on a windowsill. Jesus, he left his wallet? Whoever called in the tip must have spooked him. But Mulder was looking through the wallet with a haunted expression. Colt stared at him. What is it, Mulder? The wallet looked a lot like Colt's own, a simple brown leather fold-over with clear plastic card holders inside. Mulder held the outermost card holder, which revealed a very familiar Maryland driver's license. Colt felt his stomach rumble, and he suddenly found himself short of breath. That can't be my wallet. Unless there's another Jackson P. Colt living in Gaithersburg who has a Platinum American Express card and a membership to Blockbuster Video. Mulder looked up, stricken. I'm sorry, Agent Colt. So am I, Johnson said, grabbing Colt by the arms. Jackson Colt, you are under arrest for the murder of Julianne Kugler. You have the right to remain silent. El Paso County Jail, El Paso, Texas, April 9th, 1995. I'm sorry, Jack. Colt found Mulder's words to be the coldest of comforts as he sat in the jail cell. He'd never been inside one of these when it was locked before. Visually, it wasn't all that much different from what it was like when the door was open, but psychologically, the difference was vast. Colt had never been claustrophobic, but it wasn't difficult to get such pangs now, knowing that he was fully restricted to this tiny space. There were 6 cells on this floor, but his was the only one occupied. A uniformed officer sat at a desk on the far end of the room, a TV monitor on the desk that showed the officer images of each of the cells. He'd been arraigned within a few hours of being arrested. The prosecutor provided affidavits from Johnson and Martinez, bastards, who said that Colt was surly and unstable and unpleasant and insulting. And then he said that Colt was a flight risk because of his FBI ties. And then he mentioned Barry, and how his ex-partner's recent death while in FBI custody might have unhinged him. I called Skinner, well, actually, Scully called him, but He said the Bureau can't do anything officially except cooperate with local authorities. The judge was all too eager to remand him without bail until trial. After all, another judge had just granted Frank Nobilis an appeal hearing based on the reasonable doubt created by the murders of Donna Alvarez, Eleanor Underwood, and Julianne Kugler while Nobilis was incarcerated. For what it's worth, I think this just lends support to the shapeshifter theory. I believe the inert matter is the skin cells of the shapeshifter. Scully said it was DNA that they couldn't identify, and it would make sense that we wouldn't know what to look for in this kind of DNA profile. Colt was barely paying attention to Mulder. None of it made any sense. How could Hoblock be in two places at once? How could someone who looked enough like Colt that 8 different people swore it was him exist without his knowing about it? How could so much evidence point to so many different people who weren't the El Paso Ripper? Great, he muttered. Now I'm calling him the El Paso Ripper. What was that? Mulder said. Nothing. He shook his head. His life was falling apart, and all he could do was castigate himself for using a stupid nickname. Mulder looked nonplussed for a second, then continued. Well, anyhow, Agent Scully and I plan to go home, interrupted the voice of Martin Johnson. The man himself was coming through the door. Scully came in behind him, looking annoyed. Excuse me? Mulder got nonplussed again. The FBI has been uninvited from participating in this investigation, Agent Mulder, Johnson said formally. This is a crime that ain't crossed state lines, so y'all are only here by our invitation, and that invitation's been revoked. Detective, there's still a case to be solved here, Mulder started, but Johnson held a hand up. I don't want to hear it, Agent Mulder. I'm sorry I flew to Washington, and I'm sorry this all happened. I want you and Agent Scully out of my jurisdiction by tomorrow morning. He turned to look at Colt. Johnson's eyes were haggard and sad, Colt noticed, though he was hardly about to sympathize with the detective given his own position. As for you, Jack, you'll be staying here in regular lockup. You'll get this floor to yourself. I ain't about to put no federal agent in a max security prison. Your life wouldn't be worth a wooden peso, so you'll stay here until trial. Mulder stared at Johnson. You're making a mistake, Detective. The killer's still out there, and he can look like anybody, and he'll kill again. Colt rolled his eyes and lay down on the wafer-thin mattress on the rickety bunk. Count on good old spooky Mulder to keep hammering the nonsense. But was it nonsense? As he watched Mulder and Scully reluctantly leave the floor, each giving him an encouraging look before departing, Colt wondered if Mulder's notion was so crazy. After all, somebody was on that hospital video footage, and somebody dropped Kugler's body in the cemetery. Johnson gave him a sympathetic look of his own, but while Colt was willing to accept such from Scully and Mulder, he had no intent of doing so with the one who put the cuffs on him. Get the hell out of here, Martin. I'm sorry about this, Jack, but you said it yourself. The evidence don't lie. With that, Colt was left alone with his thoughts. Well, no, not quite alone. There was the guard at the desk. About 30 seconds after Johnson left, the guard got up and walked over to the cell. I'm really sorry about all this, Agent Colt. If it makes you feel any better, they don't have any evidence supporting the notion that you killed any of the others. Just Miss Kugler. She was a sweet lady. I didn't particularly want to kill her like I did the others, but I needed to set you up. Colt looked at the guard, whose nameplate read Niven. What are you... See, you were getting too close. Well, you weren't. Mulder and Scully were. Those two are good. Mulder actually colors outside the lines every once in a while, and Scully's brilliant. Between the two of them, they probably would have tracked me down. Hell, Mulder's the only one who recognized the corpse dust. I figured somebody from around these parts would get the reference, but no such luck. Anyhow, I couldn't afford to let you feds get too close, so I found a brunette to fit the profile, killed her in the usual way, and then I framed you for the murder. Now Colt was staring openly at Niven. This can't be. Oh, it is. It was fun there for a while, watching Detective Johnson and then you run around like hamsters in a wheel. But now they're sending in the big guns. I can't have that, so I'm done. I'm leaving El Paso. Probably won't even kill anymore. Honestly, the thrill of that was going away anyhow. I'll just go somewhere else. Find another hobby to occupy myself. Finally, Colt realized what was happening. All right, Officer Niven, very funny, but I'm not in the mood for jokes. Oh, no, this is no joke, Agent Colt. He sighed. Fine, I'll prove it to you. To Colt's horror, Niven's features began to shift and move and undulate. Colt's stomach rumbled and bile rose in his throat as Niven's eyes changed position. His nose shrunk, his mouth widened, his skin tone altered. It can't be, he whispered. Mulder's nonsense was just that. The deranged ramblings of a brilliant mind that had been twisted by trauma, just like every third serial killer out there. Mulder's sister had gone missing when he was a kid, and he concocted some fantasy about aliens because that was easier for him to believe than his sister running away from home. But the whole shape-changer garbage was just that. Garbage. Things like that, and aliens, and werewolves, and things that went bump in the night weren't real. Colt knew that. Yet a different person stood before him now, wearing Officer Niven's uniform. "You'll forgive me," this new person said with Niven's voice, "if I don't do that again. It hurts. That's why I usually change shape once a year or so, but I wanted you to know the truth. I figured you deserved that much since I went and ruined your life and all." Colt continued his incredulous stare. "This is impossible." Niven shrugged his new shoulders. "Fine, don't believe it. Makes no difference to me one way or the other. Like I said, I'm leaving El Paso. Good luck with the trial." Then Niven, or whoever he was now, just turned and left. Colt was now alone on the floor. Mulder was right. The El Paso Ripper was still out there, and he would never catch him. Jack Colt screamed. Report filed by Special Agent Dana Scully on the El Paso Ripper case, April 11th, 1995. S.A. Jackson Colt was found dead in his cell this morning, an apparent suicide. Officer Darren Niven of the El Paso Police Department, who was assigned to be guarding S.A. Colt's cell, has gone missing. S.A. Colt's suicide has led to the murder of Julianne Kugler being closed, but the murders of Donna Alvarez and Eleanor Underwood are still open, since S.A. Colt was here in Washington when those murders took place. Detective Martin Johnson of the EPPD has stated that he intends to search for an accomplice of S.A. Colt's who might still be operating in El Paso. In a press conference, Detective Johnson stated unequivocally that Frank Nobilis remains the guilty party for all previous El Paso Ripper murders, with S.A. Colt and his theoretical accomplice responsible for the 3 copycats. S.A. Mulder's hypothesis that the perpetrator might be a shape-changer is unsupported by any evidence, although there has yet to be a proper explanation for the duplicate of Orville Hoblock who appeared on the Bliss Private Hospital videotape surveillance. It is also my belief that S.A. Colt is not guilty of the crime for which he was arrested. I do not believe that S.A. Colt is capable of this act. However, his suicide, the evidence against him, and the lack of evidence supporting any other perpetrator leaves any alternative avenue of investigation closed. This is, sadly, another X-file that must remain an open case for the Bureau. That is in the anthology Trust No One, published by IDW. It's got a picture of Mulder and Scully on the cover. Very cool. You should check that out. I'm sure you can find it online, along with the other 2, The Truth Is Out There and Secret Agendas. So check that out. Check me out online at DeCandido.net, on my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com, my Patreon at patreon.com/KRAD, and please do stay safe.